Good morning. Thank you for attending our webinar today. We're talking about sustainability in action and carrying on the series of webinars that we've done around the sustainability subject for the last, over the last 12 months. So we started off initially with a webinar talking about the art of the possible and how various different bits of cloud technology could be used to help to deliver a more environmentally friendly delivery of IT services and to help organisations look at ways that they can improve their sustainability goals. We followed that up with a webinar in the tail end of last year where we looked in depth about Microsoft and their own sustainability story, looking at how obviously they had developed technology that could help organisations to improve their sustainability and the journey that they're on in terms of their sustainability improvements. Today's presentation is looking at things a little bit more practically. What we're going to do is to have a look at some real life examples of how organisations have improved their sustainability by using different bits of technology. And we're going to look at the story in the whole around these items. So if I look at the agenda for today's presentation, we're going to do a quick introduction to core. I wouldn't normally start a presentation personally with talking about us as an organisation, but actually the case study subject of today's sustainability presentation is actually us. I'm going to talk about our own sustainability journey and some of the decisions that we made and ultimately what they've meant for us in terms of an organisation. So in order to put a bit of context around that, I am going to start off very quickly, just giving you a quick introduction to who we are as an organisation. We're going to talk about our journey and obviously how we have developed our sustainability story over the time, and ultimately we'll lead on at the end of the presentation to what we're continuing to do, because sustainability very much is a journey rather than destination. We're going to talk a little bit about sustainability in Microsoft Modern Workplace, just really to underline some of the elements that we've been talking about in terms of our own sustainability progress. But then we're going to look at the business sustainability benefits, which sometimes aren't necessarily tied to sustainability, but we'll cover that in the presentation. And also for anybody who is looking to try and progress a sustainability agenda within their organisation, we're going to have a look at some of the environmental sort of sustainability benefits and some of the challenges that we've seen that have come up with customers who have been looking to try and progress that through, and kind of a point counterpoint type piece that may help anybody who's trying to put a business case through their organisation. And as we said, finally, we're going to talk about the next steps, what we're doing currently in terms of our environmental agenda, and ultimately what you can do in order to help advance your goals. So without further ado, we will progress onwards. So really quick introduction to us as core for anybody who has not attended a webinar or not worked with us before. We are an SME, but we are actually quite a heavy hitter for the size of organisation that we are. We are a top 3 ranked partner by Microsoft for work with small to medium sized corporations and public sector organisations. And we're a top 3 partner for Microsoft UK partner engagement, i.e. collaborating with Microsoft to help customers solve business challenges. We're in the top 0.5% of partners for Teams licenses and Teams enablement. So we've helped lots and lots of customers to sort of start using Microsoft Teams and to mold it into a way that works for their organization. Over the pandemic, obviously, Teams has been a key technology for a lot of Microsoft houses. We've very much helped a lot of organizations through that journey. Also, for a small business, we've got a lot of firsts that we're quite proud of. We were the first ever UK-based SharePoint partner, and we actually did the first ever deployment of SharePoint in the UK back in 2001. In terms of other firsts, we helped the first central government department in the UK actually migrate to Office 365 back in 2013. So this is technology that we've been working with for a long period of time. We developed the first ever cloud identity lifecycle management solution. So this is a tool that we still offer today, which helps organisations to coexist in their legacy sort of on-premise world sometimes with identities that need to be structured in a particular way to enable legacy line of business applications to work, but ultimately also enabling them to use that identity to build a cloud-facing identity and keep everything sort of working in tandem. We delivered the first ever zero trust architecture. Zero trust is a big subject now, particularly with people in the sort of security arms of different organisations. We delivered the first one of those back in 2013, working with an organisation that had people in 120 countries across the world, sometimes in what we might consider to be hostile nation states, who needed a way of being able to securely work with sensitive information that was shared with the UK. So zero trust is something that we've been at the forefront of for a number of years. We delivered the first ever EMEA deployment of what we call modern deployment of Windows 10. You'll better know it probably as the product Microsoft call Autopilot. We were actually funded by Microsoft to help the development of that original technology, which we did using some third-party software at the time. But ultimately, that has led on to the development of the Autopilot product, which is now in use by a lot of organisations. And it's technology we're going to talk about a little today, but we were actually right at the forefront of that too. And in addition to that, we've also helped some customers build some off-premise WAN solutions, which enables great location portability, something we're going to talk about again today. And finally, we helped one of the first NHS or NHS N365 stakeholders to make the migration into the N365 platform, which is a shared Microsoft 365 platform for the National Health Service. So quite a few firsts that we're proud of. As we said, very highly accredited. Microsoft partnered with 10 gold certifications in the key technologies that ultimately underpin a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today. As an organisation, we've got some key values that we strive to live by. So the key one for us is always, and it comes first, is customers. We are a customer-centric organisation, and our customers come first in all of our thought processes. Handily, these four sort of key pillars form a mnemonic which spells core, which is quite useful. Good one, marketing team. So customers come first. One core is our explanation of us as an organisation. We look to recruit, develop, and retain the best sort of talent from the IT industry, and we work together as one unit. So ultimately, with us being a small organisation, for us to make sure that everybody's working as a cohesive group and that we get the best overall outcome. And that helps us with our third value, which is responsiveness. We run a lot of mission critical services for our customers. It's important that we're responsive and that we're able to help customers to keep their services live and running. And then last but by no means least, we develop expertise. There are certain key areas of technology that you need to get right in order to make sure that everybody has a good experience. And we constantly enable our staff to train and keep ahead of the technology as it advances. We're members of a lot of sort of groups within the Microsoft community where we're helping to shape and develop different products. And ultimately, that expertise helps us to deliver all of the other values that we hold dear as an organisation. So, I'm forgetting that there's a slide there. We work with a wide range of customers. So as you can see from some of the logos that are on here, we work with people in all aspects of the public sector, which is the bit of the business that I'm responsible for, but also a lot of organisations in the private sector, banking, retail, the sort of legal industry. We touch a lot of different industries. So we've got a great experience base when we're working with customers from any walk of So why was all that important? Well, ultimately, I think getting a bit of an understanding about who we are as an organisation helps us to put our journey in context. And as I said earlier on in the presentation, our sustainability programme is a journey. It's not a destination. Things are constantly changing, and obviously as a result of which we're constantly adapting to the changing world, to the things we could do now that we couldn't do before, and ultimately always looking to strive to take that next step forward. And our journey has been quite an interesting one. Ultimately, we started out on our sustainability journey, where sustainability was one of the benefits that we sought as an outcome, as opposed to being the only outcome. And I think the big theme of today's presentation is that sustainability doesn't need to be a cost to an organisation. We've achieved all of our sustainability goals through actually solving other business challenges, and that really is the crux of ultimately what this sort of case study is about. To give you some examples, ultimately we started to adopt a lot of the technology that is driving our sustainability in order to meet other business goals or challenges. We're an SME, as we mentioned earlier. We're busy. We're always working very hard. And as an organisation, we've been growing organically over a number of years. And as a result of which, we've needed to make sure that we had the flexibility as an organisation to cope with that growth through a number of different sort of areas, which we'll touch on as we talk through the presentation. One of the things that's there is obviously we as an organisation are headquartered in London in the UK. As anybody who is based in or around London will know, the cost per square foot of office space in London is particularly high. And one of the things that we did as soon as the technology was available was look at ways that we could reduce our requirement for office footprint by not having huge amounts of space taken up with internal infrastructure. Before the sort of birth of Microsoft Cloud, we used to host infrastructure in tier 1 data centers as opposed to having it in the office, because ultimately it was a way of us ensuring that we were using the space for what it was designed for, which is to have people collaborating. Ultimately, when Azure became a product, we then looked to adopt that, and ultimately that's driven some of our sustainability goals. We said when we were talking about us as an organisation that one of our key strengths, one of our key goals, is to make sure that we recruit and retain the best talent. It will come as no shock to anybody who's recruiting for any role that talent isn't necessarily based around one geographic area, and certainly even though London is our capital and obviously a hub of innovation, not every single best of breed technical expert is based in the London area. So in order for us to make sure that we always hired the right person for our roles and that we maintained the expertise that we need as an organisation, we very early on realised that we had to cast the net a bit wider and look to recruit people from wherever they happen to be in the UK. And as a result of which, in order to make that work for the individuals and also for us as a business, we needed to make sure that we had a way for people to be able to work efficiently without having to be in the office. And that led to us ultimately, very early on, making an investment in Microsoft 365 or Office 365 as it was in those days, and developing all of our systems, whether they be the Microsoft 365 ones or the services that we host in Azure, to make sure that people could work as efficiently from their home or from somewhere else in the UK than they could do in the office. And that was one of our sort of business imperatives to make sure that worked. And that ultimately drove one of our sort of adoption reasons for that modern workplace technology. Because we wanted to be able to do that in a secure way, because a lot of times we're dealing with information that is obviously sensitive to us as an organisation or to our customers, we needed to make sure that we had a way of securing securing the way those people were working when they were working remotely. And that led to us obviously issuing out our staff with devices. Now, because they're remote in nature and because there would be occasions when they would be travelling, we took the decision very early on to issue everybody with corporate laptops as opposed to desktop machines. And that ultimately has some actual environmental benefits for us, as well as the ability for us to make sure that people could work effectively and securely from wherever they are. And then finally, obviously with that remote workforce, we have the other challenge of, great, so they've got a laptop, but obviously a laptop isn't necessarily always the most useful communication tool. If you're traveling, maybe a mobile device might be a better option. So as a business, we had a discussion and built a policy around what are we going to do about mobile phones? Do we issue people with corporate phones, which we can obviously secure and lock down like a laptop? Or do we find a way of securing our corporate applications on people's own devices? And ultimately, people who worked for us, certainly as an organisation, it may not be true for every organisation, preferred the idea of just having one phone rather than having to carry two around. And ultimately, that sort of pushed us into a place where we decided that BYOD for mobile devices was absolutely the way forward for us as an organisation. So some of the decision-making process we went through, it's probably worth focusing on some of the benefits that we saw from this stuff as a business, as well as obviously the sustainability side. So as we said, ultimately by nearshoring our compute infrastructure, we removed the need to have office space taken up with compute items, which was handy because it meant that we could use our office space, which costs a lot of money, to better effect for human beings as opposed to just stacking it with it had a couple of other benefits as well. Ultimately, one of the key things that is worth considering for any organisation is that model gives us location portability. I mentioned earlier on that we're a growing organisation. We're actually currently in the third set of offices that we have occupied in the last 5 years. And those transitions have been nice and easy for us because we haven't had to worry about moving live services that we're hosting either for us or for our customers from one office location to the other. They're in the cloud. They don't need to relocate. So when we grew and decided that we needed to take on slightly bigger office space in I think it was probably 2018. That was fine. We actually moved over a weekend, and it was very easy for us to actually occupy an office that had more desk space for our growing team of people. And then in September 2020, as a result of some changes and obviously in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we decided that actually we were pivoting to a role where, or to an organisational model where most people would be working from home most of the time, and as a result of which we actually took the opportunity to move into a new shared office space where we had a smaller direct footprint, where we had the ability to expand and flex and actually move, basically move into new working areas if we needed them, to have access to a wide range of meeting rooms, and ultimately be able to have maximum flexibility around our office space location. So that was made infinitely easier by having all of our compute actually operating. That also has another benefit, the high efficiency element. Ultimately, the technology that's run in the Microsoft Cloud is highly efficient. Cloud computing is a utility, a business decision by Microsoft that again wasn't just about sustainability, was for them to opt for the most energy efficient, high performing infrastructure that they could buy in order to make sure that their utility cost was as low as possible to make the cloud computing cost as competitive as possible for customers. Now, ultimately, we benefit from that financially, but we also benefit from that from a sustainability standpoint. And ultimately, Microsoft's journey, which we'll come on to in a bit, has helped to improve that from an environmental standpoint. One of the key goals of any IT infrastructure platform is to make sure it's available for users. And certainly over the years, I've spoken to a number of IT managers and IT leaders who have been a little bit reluctant to look at the cloud because there's a feeling of a bit of a lack of control. Ultimately, if you've got your own on-premise infrastructure, you can manage it, you can control it, you can be hands-on with it, and you can make sure that the service is highly available. Well, ultimately, in order for services like Microsoft 365 to go mainstream, Microsoft have had to ensure that the way that they orchestrate the platform and the way that the platform is architected is designed to deliver high availability. And we've seen over the years that we've been consuming those services, the actual availability SLA improve significantly over time, and ultimately to a point now where Microsoft 365 as a platform, which sits in Azure and runs in the same data centers, is the backbone of a lot of organizations. It's highly available, very rarely causes any problems, and there's a lot of built-in resilience and redundancy into that. So, ultimately we benefit from that as a customer, but ultimately, that journey is ongoing as well. So laptops, we issued, as we said, corporate laptops to users. That was designed to solve a business challenge, but actually it also helped our overall sustainability footprint, because as many of you will be aware, a laptop's power consumption is typically 1/3 of that of a desktop machine. They're not quite as power hungry. They, ultimately, again, they can run on battery for a lot of the time, but they are, with some exceptions, they are among the most energy efficient devices. I will call out a couple of left fielders. For anybody who is aware of the Lenovo Tiny PC range, that is a desktop machine, which is albeit in a very small form factor, and ultimately uses laptop style architecture in order to deliver a very low sort of power draw. And then also from a end user compute standpoint, anybody who's using thin clients, again, it's a very similar story. Those are small sort of form factor devices that tend to use a lot of low power equipment within them. The only drawback being that they're still being powered by compute, which is typically driven by servers, probably on premise. So our overall approach was to go fat client, with cloud-based sort of compute. And using laptops, we believe that we're in the most sustainable configuration we can get from an end user perspective. So enabling BYOD obviously had a couple of business impacts for us initially. One of them was that financially, we didn't have to shell out for a fleet of mobile phones for our users. Anybody who issues mobile phones to users, corporate mobile phones, will know they seem to get damaged a lot more frequently than personal phones. Maybe people just aren't as careful with them. But ultimately, not only did we save some money, but actually there's a whole sustainability story behind this. Any bit of IT infrastructure that you buy for an organization, whether it's end user compute or infrastructure, there's a whole process there. They're made of precious metal or precious metals and minerals, which need to be mined. That is a hugely energy intensive process, which generates a lot of CO2. It's then got to be manufactured, it's then got to be shipped, it's then got to be obviously prepared. And there's a whole sort of carbon life cycle there that we have avoided, albeit for a small number of, for a fairly small number of phones. But actually, if you calculated the environmental cost of supplying those phones to users, that's probably equivalent to 5 years worth of use. And again, we're not having people charging 2 phones a day in order to operate, which is also obviously then having an impact on energy that we're consuming and therefore CO2 that we're emitting. So, as I think you can see, probably, just looking at those few concepts in sort of an abstract, everything that we've done as an organisation has helped us towards our sustainability goals, but it's actually also had a positive financial impact on us. And this is the bit that so often gets missed with sustainability presentations. It's not about extracting more money from your organisation to meet a sustainability goal. It's about having sustainability as a byproduct of business decision making. So we've talked a bit about Microsoft sustainability and ultimately how leveraging the Microsoft Cloud helps us as an organisation, and we are just going to touch on a couple of bits here just to try and flesh that story out a little bit. So Microsoft are on their own environmental journey or sustainability journey. They've recently, actually, in the last 2 years, Satya Nadella has commissioned a $1 billion climate innovation fund, which is designed actually to help Microsoft in some of their strategic goals, but ultimately is being invested in carbon capture technologies. The idea being that it's not just good enough to offset carbon emissions. What they actually want to do is look at ways of actually extracting carbon either from their business operations or even from the atmosphere. And that's one of the things that they're looking to do on top of the other bits on this slide, and we're going to come on to that innovation fund in a bit. So if you are a Microsoft Azure or Microsoft 365 customer in the US, currently those data centers are completely 100% powered by renewable energy sources, and they have been since 2014. We're not quite there in the UK, as you'll notice from this point. We're actually above 60% now, but I'm not quite sure what the exact number is. Ultimately we have a similar mix of solar and wind, but the US have also got some hydropower that goes into theirs, which obviously helps them up. And to be fair, they probably get better weather than we do for solar. So we mentioned that their business model was to ultimately put very high-end servers into the infrastructure. That was for a number of reasons. Ultimately, it was for to keep the costs down in terms of the actual utility cost of providing the compute, but also around keeping down the operational costs. If you buy very highly efficient servers that are very well manufactured, your cost of keeping that hardware alive over a period of time is lower. The actual lifespan of the hardware can be longer, particularly if you're able to make sure that it's not overly taxed by running good sort of orchestration of the infrastructure. And ultimately, the sheer volume of hardware that organizations like Microsoft and obviously other cloud providers have bought of that ilk has led to there being an increase in research and development in making that technology sort of better and more efficient. And we're seeing the benefits from that as we go on, as the Microsoft 365 and Azure data centers expand, as the sort of regular hardware refresh cycles are happening. Ultimately, the technology that's going in there is even more efficient and therefore even more sustainable than the technology that started out. And ultimately, what this is all leading to, they're looking at ways that they can improve the kind of thermal dynamics of the hardware, As you all know, if you run your own data center, ultimately, if hardware gets hot, that reduces the operating lifespan of that hardware. If it gets hot sort of frequently, it can lead to mechanical issues, it can lead to issues with disks and sort of other moving parts, and it can also fatigue a lot of the metal parts inside the devices. So reducing heat is key, not only for the longevity of the devices, but again, ultimately, for every kilowatt of energy that you expend on compute power, you have to expend another kilowatt of energy in order to cool that down and obviously keep the temperature under control. If we can reduce the operating temperature of the hardware in the first place, we're reducing the cost of the energy and the obviously volume of energy that we need to keep. So, and as we've said, ultimately that sustainability is baked in, and I think the pie chart here is a good example of explaining exactly how ultimately how this all works. The infrastructure efficiency, so the way that it's architected and put together and the way that it's run through the orchestration, which is the operational efficiency, coupled with the actual hardware itself, contributes over 3/4 of the environmental sort of benefit of the Microsoft cloud. The renewable electricity, and bearing in mind that the sort of global mix here is about 80%, is actually a small part. It will grow as the sort of UK and EU catches up to that 100% renewable energy mix that they have in the US. But it's actually the smaller problem to solve. And one of the things that we talk about a lot with customers is in comparison to you running an on-site data center, and we're just talking about the running costs here, we're not talking about any of that carbon life cycle from mining, manufacture through to delivery of on-premise hardware to customers. Typically speaking, depending on where you are in the country and depending on what you're running services in the Microsoft Cloud will be between 79 and 93% more energy efficient, just because of the hardware and the orchestration that's being used. And when taking renewable energy into account, the Azure compute stack is typically 92 to 98% lower in terms of carbon emissions per user per year than an on-premise data center. So bold claims backed up by third parties, ultimately looking to migrate workloads to the cloud, as you're probably aware because it's a common talking point, is a great way of improving organizational sustainability. So we mentioned earlier, and this is the last slide on Microsoft sustainability, but we mentioned earlier that Microsoft is on its own journey and that it's put together this $1 billion sort of carbon fund. What Microsoft is seeking to do is actually quite revolutionary and quite ambitious. So not only are they seeking to become a carbon neutral organization, they're looking to become carbon negative, i.e. they are actually essentially getting rid of more carbon than they in the atmosphere or in the environment than they create as an organization. And their actual overall target is to get to a point where they've actually not just negated their carbon, their live carbon emissions, but ultimately that they've actually made up for and removed the entire carbon emissions that they've generated over their lifespan as an organization. As you can see here, we're on a good trajectory. The increased efficiency that's being put into the Microsoft data centers is having an impact in terms of reducing the overall net carbon emissions. Microsoft is taking into account its supply chain, not just their own carbon emissions, but also the emissions of that cradle to grave of the hardware that's put into place. And ultimately, they're transitioning, and in fact they transitioned sort of last year from a place where they were doing carbon offsetting, so obviously investing in schemes to actually help to reduce their carbon emissions as an organization, to now actually getting into that carbon removal piece. So it's a great story. It's a great story for any customer of Microsoft because if everything goes according to plan and on target, which they're on target at the moment, they will be customers consuming services through Microsoft Cloud will be consuming carbon neutral services by 2030. Probably ahead of that actually by 2025, I think is the actual target. But you will be consuming compute services that are carbon neutral, which is fantastic. So let's have a look at a couple of scenarios. We've talked a little bit about what we've done as an organisation. I want to talk about some real life examples of areas where we've actually been able to achieve operational improvements, as well as obviously improve our sustainability standpoint. I'm going to focus on one that I think was the subject of one of our first environmental webinar that we did, which is around modern deployment, i.e. autopilot. And ultimately, we view autopilot as a much more efficient way of deploying devices to users in terms of the time to value. So ultimately, the process of getting a device to a new user or to a user who requires a replacement device is far quicker. There's far less potential downtime, far less human effort involved in that process. And ultimately, there's a strong environmental story there as well. So if we look at how we traditionally deploy laptops in today's world for organizations that are using services like SCCM, this is typically what it would look like. You would ultimately buy equipment from a distributor who has been supplied by a manufacturer, who's been through that entire process of mining the raw materials, getting the raw materials in, building the machines, which is, like you say, a very carbon intensive process. And in today's world, in the UK channel, US channel, typically that hardware would go to a distributor. It would be bought in bulk by a reseller, and then you as the customer would probably deal with a reseller who would then ship the hardware to you. A lot of customers that we deal with today typically have their equipment shifted to them or shipped to them in bulk because they have their own storage facilities. Now, in the vast majority of cases, particularly for customers in and around the London area, that storage is very infrequently on site where the IT team is. So when we're talking about our journey here, the reseller shipped the hardware probably in pallets to the customer, using probably a heavy goods vehicle in order to get that hardware to the customer. It goes to the customer's storage facility. It then probably requires some form of further transit to get to the IT team. It might not be a van, it might be a car. It might be that somebody can walk to the storage facility with a trailer or with a trolley, but ultimately we're kind of working on an average case scenario here. So the hardware goes to the IT team. It then needs to be prepared for the user with internal imaging infrastructure, which again has been through this entire process. So there's a whole carbon life cycle behind getting that hardware in place to the organization to be able to image the devices. And then ultimately when that's done, then the device needs to go to the user. Now, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a really good chance that user might actually be working in the office location where the IT team was. Not always guaranteed. But ultimately, for the vast majority of organizations, that might be true. However, there's a couple of connotations to this. Larger organizations may not have an IT team based in every single location, so there may still be an onward journey to get that device to the user. And obviously, since March 2020, a lot of our working practices organizations have changed, and there's a very high probability chance that not every user is working in the office every day, which means that if a new user is joining, or if a user requires the device refresh, they're going to have to make a specific journey to come into the office to collect that hardware. So quite a long process. Autopilot shortens that journey considerably. The manufacturer and the distributor and the reseller are still sort of as was, but ultimately, instead of you buying devices in bulk and getting them delivered to your storage area, most of the resellers that work in the UK will happily ship devices to the end user. And they'll do that using a courier, using a multi-point courier. So not only are we shortening the number of trips that this device has to have, and therefore shortening the road miles and the carbon footprint associated with that, but also we're taking out some of these steps, which means it's quicker for the user to actually get working with the device. For those of you that haven't run with autopilot before, you can receive a device straight out of the box from the reseller. The user would need to plug it into the power, switch it on, connect it to their Wi-Fi, and then enter their username and password. And that is it. Then the autopilot process takes over. It will take the device under management, deploy the applications that are packaged for the user. The whole process typically takes between 20 and 40 minutes from the unboxing of the device. So it's very, very quick. This process here, the IT team imaging the device and getting it ready for a user, typically speaking, takes between 2 and 5 days, depending on the situation. So we're taking, potentially 1.5 to 4.5 days out of that entire cycle, which obviously is great from a user productivity So from an environmental standpoint, it's also worth mentioning, if you're buying goods in bulk, as we said, you're probably going to get them delivered to your storage facility in some sort of HGV, which may do 2 or 3 drops, but ultimately it's a big energy, sort of energy consuming vehicle that will be delivering a significant load to you as an organization. And obviously, again, same thing for the infrastructure. If you're getting your reseller to ship out devices to an end user, they will probably be using existing courier services, multi-point, multi-drop delivery drivers, who may only have to make a couple of miles, or a mile divert from their normal delivery route in order to get that device in the hands of the user. So smaller vehicles, more fuel efficient, less what we would call route diversion, so less actual dedicated miles in order to get that device into the hand. So great sustainability story aside from the reduction in requirement for infrastructure on premise and if you have deployed a device through modern deployment, you are also geared up to manage that device through what we call modern management, which is using Microsoft Endpoint Manager as the technology to actually manage that device moving forward. And this also presents us with an opportunity to help to speed up the resolution of a lot of common IT issues, but also to reduce a lot of the moving parts and potential journeys that you might have in today's world if a user develops an IT fault. Just talking through this one again, we do this as an organisation ourselves because of our dispersed workforce. So the user has an issue with a device, something's not working correctly, they contact the service desk. The service desk will log into that device through, either their sort of existing agent sort of system or some other factor, and they'll have a look at the device. And anybody who works in IT support will know 90 to 95% of user issues typically roll back to a software type fault. There's a hardware fault with the device has got to be replaced, and we're back into the world of imaging versus sort of pilot deployment. But ultimately, 95% of issues typically exist within the software plane. And the kind of worst case scenario is if you wipe the device and then reinstall everything, that can quite often solve even the most aggressive of software issues. But in order to do that in a traditional deployment model, that device has got to go back to the IT team because it's got to go back through the sort of re-imaging process that you had beforehand. And ultimately, that might be that you repair the user's device and they have some downtime while you're getting that done, and then you give the device back to them. Or you may want to use some swap stock if you have it. If you have some spare laptops, you might want to configure a device for that user, let them take it away, repair their device, and put it back in swap stock. Either way, it doesn't matter. But ultimately, chances are that if your users are working remotely in today's world, they're going to have to come into the IT team to get that done. And there is going to be a lead time and some resource involved in repairing the device and or giving the user a device from swap stock. Through modern device management, we can do all this through the cloud, and we actually don't need to get the device back into IT. All of the software can be managed on the device through Microsoft Endpoint Manager, which is based in the cloud, a product we formerly know as Intune. And ultimately, everything can be amended or changed on the device using Intune without IT actually having to physically device. If we have a fault that we cannot repair and then we need to do a full wipe and restore on the device, that can actually be accomplished through autopilot. So the user can actually self-generate that, or the IT team can trigger that process using their remote access tools. And ultimately, it avoids the need for us to get the user to come back in. So we're reducing potential road miles. We don't need any infrastructure to do it. We don't need to give the user a new device necessarily, which means that we're not having to have a huge stock of replacement devices to allow for all of these different scenarios. And ultimately, again, in terms of speed, typically speaking, a wipe and restore with an autopilot device will probably take about an hour to complete cradle to grave. It's highly unlikely that the on-premise IT team could turn it around that quickly with the number of other requests that they have to. So, ultimately, yet again, we've got a good business outcome for the organisation, lower cost, lower resource use, but also no need or a good sort of strong environmental story as well. So going back to sort of stepping away from technology and looking at us as our own case study here. Typically speaking, on any given day, 90% of core staff are working. There's a small contingent that may go into the office either for team meetings or for other activities that require kind of a face-to-face engagement. But otherwise, everybody's pretty much working from home. Nobody has any loss of functionality or features. Everybody who works for Core can do exactly what they would need to do or what they could do on premise from their home location. That includes running services, administering services for our customers. We've got some good privileged identity management and sort of privileged access management solutions in place, which enable us to do that quite safely and securely from whatever location we happen to be in. As a result of that policy, we've reduced the burden on transit infrastructure, reducing CO2 emissions. So ultimately, less people are driving, either to get to the train station or to get to another location. We'd prefer that people cycle and walk, but we've got some people out in remote locations where they are, where they're so far away from public transport infrastructure that they do need to have a little bit of a car journey. But them not being on public transport infrastructure also has a benefit. The more people there are on a train, ultimately the more energy is required to move that train. So by reducing the number of people on the train, we're reducing the energy consumed per journey. The technology that we adopted to solve our business challenges supports this, but also gives us that reduced, sort of environmental impact as an organisation through embracing the modern workplace. We've also reduced our office footprint. So we've taken on a smaller dedicated workspace, which means that we're not consuming as much power, we're not consuming as much heating in the winter or cooling in the summer because there aren't as many people there that we need to accommodate for, and we're not lighting as big a space. So we're reducing the energy consumption that we have as an organisation, even though actually it's not our direct consumption because it's part of our lease agreement within the shared working space that we occupy. But that shared working space gives us the flexibility to scale it up and down on demand. If we need to do an all-day sort of all-hands meeting, we have the ability to expand our workspace into meeting rooms and other areas so that we've got places for those additional heads to work that don't necessarily have a dedicated space in our sort of main office footprint. But by doing that, we're also helping to drive other environmental factors which may or may not fit into our ESG policy, but are worth considering from a general sustainability standpoint. We're reducing the demand for commercial office space in London. We're not requiring an office space that has 80 desks available in it. We're actually operating on a much smaller number. So therefore, we're helping to reduce the demand for huge construction projects, which ultimately also have a massive environmental impact. In the office space that we're in, we're reducing the wear and tear in commercial space. As people, obviously the more people are using the building facilities, the more wear and tear there's going to be. Flooring, lifts, things along those, chairs, desks, they're not being used as heavily and therefore they're not needing to be replaced as frequently, which also then reduces that sort of manufacturing, cradle to grave lifestyle or life cycle, which also has CO2 tied up in it. We need a smaller internet connection in the office because we're not having to support a huge number of users all the time, which means that we're not consuming as much power in terms of internal network infrastructure, and ultimately we're not requiring as much bandwidth from the telecom providers, which again has knock-on effects on the CO2 there. From a user perspective, this model of working is much better for anybody who's got any care responsibilities. So people who work for Core who've got children have got a much easier way of managing their care responsibilities. People who are living with maybe or supporting elderly relatives or relatives with health conditions, again have got that sort of flexibility to be local and to be available just in case they're needed. There's no issues with people having to run back and forth from the office in order to take care of stuff that is equally as important in their life, but it's not related to. And then finally, different people psychologically have different working patterns. Some people are much more productive at different times of the day than others. And ultimately, this model enables those in roles that aren't customer facing and that ultimately just require outcomes to flex their working day to the optimal model for that individual. So maybe around their care responsibilities, or maybe just to get the best out of their own personal psyche. If they are a morning person and like to get up early and get work done, early in the day, the technology enables them to do that without having to make a very difficult journey into the office. Equally, for those who are night owls, and I would class myself in that boat, I tend to do my most creative work in the evenings. I have the ability to be able to do that from the comfort of my own home whenever the mood takes me. I don't have to be in the office in order to leverage that creative self. So there's a sort of view, I guess, of what we've seen as the benefits aligned to sustainability. We've been talking to customers for a number of years about their sustainability goals and how they can help to achieve them. During that time, we've picked up on a lot of the challenges that organisations have seen, or that maybe the business case for this type of sort of approach has seen in an organisation. So what I wanted to do is really just give a quick sort of counterpoint to some of those challenges. Some of them are actually very topical in today's news. One of the key ones, less use of public transport may lead to increased cost per journey. So actually we're creating a problem for the organisation by making travel more expensive. That is a potential, as with anything, but ultimately what I think we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic as an example, is that ultimately, because there were fewer people using public transport particularly, a lot of the services were realigned, and maybe there wasn't quite as much volume or velocity of services, which ultimately meant that the costs for the transport providers were reduced, and therefore the impact on them that might cause them to have to increase their pricing was reduced quite substantially. So ultimately, there is, I think, a strong counterpoint for that one. Power consumption may not change; it just shifts from the company to the user. That's very true. At the end of the day, one of the things you could almost call greenwashing is if you can, as an organisation, lift users out of your organisation and get them to work from home, you will be able to reduce your office premises energy consumption, which obviously looks very, very good in the reports, but actually, is the same amount of energy being consumed by those users. You're just moving the problem elsewhere. Well, maybe not. Speaking personally, while I'm working from home, I have a light which I have on today, an LED light, which is very low power, which I use when I'm on calls like this. So I don't look like a silhouette with a window behind me, but I don't have all of the lights on in my office because I don't need them. Typically speaking, from a health and safety perspective, most offices need to be very well lit to make sure that the organisation is protected from potential legal issues. I don't have that problem here, and as a result of which I'm probably consuming less energy working from home if I was actually sat in the office. So there's a counterpoint to that. The big one at the moment, topical, central government customers or central government workers are being encouraged to go back into the office because the government wants to give the sort of economic hubs a bit of a boost by getting increased throughput, people buying lunches, maybe sort of, consuming services in big economic hubs. They have suffered a little bit as a result of people actually working in a hybrid format. But actually, and I will speak personally on this one, while there might have been an impact from me not being in the London office quite as often, actually in my local economy, I'm consuming more services and actually supporting my local economy. There are days when I will go out and buy lunch locally, even though I could potentially make it in the house. Either I'm pushed for time or I feel like treating myself. Same goes for things like coffees, and ultimately, I find it easier to access local services that I might need on a personal basis because I'm at home and I'm in my local economy. So I would actually argue that my economic contribution hasn't changed in terms of its volume. It might have just shifted in terms of locality. So, but it's still ultimately helping. So the reliance on the user's internet connection is one that quite often comes up, particularly in the public sector. Do we need to equip our users with the internet? Well, that might be true in some cases, but actually the vast majority of users in today's world have probably got home internet already. And actually the average speeds of internet across the UK at the moment are sufficient that they could meet the personal needs of the householder and their family, while also supporting the working from home requirements of the user. So there shouldn't really be any need to provide any additional support. For any users that are actually in the self-assessment sort of tax model, they actually can get a sort of tax benefit for that working from home that helps to contribute towards the use of broadband and the use of energy at home. So that's all good. It's harder to manage the productivity of users when they're working remotely. In our own case study, we've actually seen an increase in productivity since we actually got more people working from home. And that's because of what we said before about the flexibility of working time. A lot of people who work at Core, even now, 2 years on from the initial sort of pandemic, move to working from home have actually turned their commute time into working time and are actually working slightly longer hours than they were beforehand. Their choice, not something that we're mandating as an organisation, but they were used to a certain pattern in the day, and they have adapted their working pattern to match in within the sort of bookends of that time period. So we're actually seeing a boost in productivity, and we're seeing people, actually able to do more per week, or to get better outcomes per week because of that flexibility working. But there are tools inside M365 that enable you as an organisation to manage productivity, some of which you can obviously use to look directly at users' productivity, but also tools like Microsoft Viva that are all about employee engagement and enabling people to work and supporting well-being. And again, they can be a useful tool or flag to make sure that people have got an appropriate workload, that they're able to respond to it, and that actually their well-being is being taken care of. This model of working may not suit all employees, and it may not be good for our business. So, distractions at home, no set workplace. That is true. And at the end of the day, we actually have a few people in core who are absolutely extroverts and get their sort of energy from social interaction. So we said 90% of people typically work from home on a daily basis. The 10% that are in the office typically tend to be those people who actually thrive in an environment where they've got warm human. And that's fine. The idea is it's supposed to be flexible working, hybrid working, not we're just working from home. So people can sort of adapt their working patterns to suit them. And what we found is that actually even those people who are totally recharged by the human interactions don't go into the office every day of the week. They might go in a couple of days a week just to get that warm human contact, just to recharge their batteries. And ultimately they get the rest of their recharges from their interactions in their private life. So doesn't fit organizational culture. We want to see our people regularly. That's one that we get quite commonly. Ultimately, it's amazing the tools that sit in Microsoft 365 that enable you to actually deliver that culture digitally as opposed to in person. There's no substitute for in-person events, and we as an organization, since the sort of pandemic restrictions have been lifted, we make a point of trying to do something on a monthly basis where we get staff who want to get together for some sort of social activity, and that's worked really, really well for us. But we've leveraged the technology to deliver. We do sort of team or multi-team meetings on a weekly basis, where we get different groups of people together to discuss operational issues that would have previously been an in-person meeting, and we do that via Teams, so video. So we've got sort of full sort of context communication where we can see people and we can talk to them. We've instigated sort of one-to-one meetings with everybody on a weekly basis. So team managers speak to their teams at least for at least once a week, on a sort of set schedule, so that it's an opportunity to catch up and just make sure that things are running smoothly. We've got team sort of social calls set up. So typically once a week, a team will get together and do some social stuff. So ultimately, our organizational culture has not been adversely affected by these changes. And then finally, the renewable energy mix may be different between office location versus employee location. That's true. But at the end of the day, that may have positives or negatives depending on where you are in the world. So we're running a little bit over time, so I'm gonna skip through this one fairly quickly. We instigated our change in working practices as part of our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We actually jumped in and got everybody to start working from home as their primary place of work a few days ahead of Boris Johnson actually announcing the lockdowns. And the key bits are ultimately we didn't have to have anybody coming into the office because we had no critical infrastructure to support. So we were able to make sure that all of our staff were able to shield and not travel, during the COVID pandemic. And we didn't have to have any exceptions during the lockdown process because everything's hosted in the cloud, and we can administer it and run it without having to send somebody to any specific site. And critically, all implementing these changes, we had no adverse impact on customer delivered services. We had no loss of workforce, and we had very few people that were actually impacted by the COVID-19 virus, which is good. And we had, our business was not impacted by travel disruption, changes, extensions to the lockdown, anything along those lines. Ultimately, we'd already had the technology in place. It was a very easy issue for us to navigate. So to recap on the key benefits of what we've done as an organisation, we've reduced business interruption by having tools that enabled a user's devices to be repaired or restored very, very quickly, using cloud-based platforms which are highly available. We've been able to improve the use of our resources. We're not having to stand up lots and lots of infrastructure internally. We're not having to support it. And we're not having to have IT be hands-on with every single device deployment or every single device repair. We've enabled flexible working, which we believe has given a boost to our staff and our team, and ultimately, enable them to get the best out of their working day. We've got rid, the only on-premise hardware we have, apart from users' devices when they bring them in, is we've got some very rudimentary network infrastructure in offices. That is it. No servers. Nothing that we need that takes a huge amount of space or power. And then finally, because of the work that Microsoft's been doing and their constant improvements in SLA, we are able to benefit from high availability for the services that keep our business running, and we're able to deliver high quality, highly resilient, highly available services to our customers. So bringing things together, our environmental journey continues. We've made an environmental commitment this year, which is that we are committed to leading by example, part of what this presentation is about, to encourage our customers to do the same as we launch our sustainability program in 2022. We're looking potentially at offsetting our own carbon usage and providing more sustainable solutions for our customers. So what does that look like? Well, we've been consistently reducing our carbon usage as well as we are developing new services, as we are refreshing our end user devices, which are getting more and more energy efficient as the year go on, and helping our customers to get rid of their private data centers. We have significantly helped to make a big impact on CO2 emissions for the people that we work with and touch as an organisation. We are in the sort of final stages of looking at how we actually offset the impacts of our business that we can't control. We've got this end user device estate out there. It is consuming electricity, and ultimately there is a carbon impact from that. So we're partnering with different experts in the field to look at a a long-term program that we can implement that will help us to actually offset our own usage, so that when we're working with customers, they can be satisfied that the Microsoft Cloud is getting to a carbon neutral position, and ultimately we are looking to see if we can replicate that ourselves as well with a carbon neutral, offsetting the carbon that our operation has, so that we can become a carbon neutral offset or a carbon neutral service. And then ultimately, once we've managed to test that out ourselves and make sure that it works and actually delivers what it's supposed to, our plans are that we will be looking to actually launch that as a customer-facing service, so that customers can also look at offsetting the carbon of their end user device estates as well, in combination with our current desktop managed service. And then ultimately, we're looking at carbon management tooling, so that we continually monitor and ultimately make sure that we are offsetting the right amount for us as a business, but also for any customers that we work with, and ultimately looking at helping to make sure that we're always looking at the best possible available service, the most assured service for that carbon, for that carbon offsetting. So, and ultimately, we hope that will help to improve our existing working relationships with customers. We already have great working relationships and great feedback from customers. We regularly get 10 out of 10 scores back from customers and a small. But ultimately, in line with sustainability, as a final call to action, what can we do? What can we now do practically as a result of this of this sort of case study? Well, there's a few things we can do. If you as an organisation are looking at how you can reduce the carbon footprint of your operations, particularly looking at the modern deployment and modern management technologies, you can book with us an endpoint management workshop where we can help you to look at, okay, what would be involved in doing this? What would the transition look like? How can you get from where you are now to that world? We can run that workshop with you. There's also a general technology roadmap. There will be a lot of services within your Microsoft 365 licensing that you are paying for today that might actually be being replicated by other third-party licensing or services that you're running. Maybe stuff that you're running on premise, which is also then consuming energy and carbon when it doesn't. A technology roadmap with Core will help you to identify where those exist and look at making structural cost savings that also have that environment. We have a number of Microsoft Cloud Accelerator Program workshops, which are funded by Microsoft. So there's no cost to you as a customer. And if you are interested, there's full details on the website. Have a look at those workshops, have a conversation with us, and we'll check your eligibility for funding, and we can deliver some of those on Microsoft's dollar instead of your own. And then keep an eye out on our website for blogs, news articles, and other content. As we develop our offerings and as we develop our sort of carbon commitment within our organisation, we'll be updating everybody, and ultimately we'll give you a view to see how we're getting on and how we're doing. But also, if you have an interest in looking at something like a carbon neutral desktop offering, we will announce it on the website when it is available. So 2 minutes over the published time, but it looks like we didn't lose many attendees. So thank you for your kind attention. If anybody has any questions to ask, we don't have to run off straight away, so please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. Otherwise, let me say thank you for your time. I hope the webinar was useful, and I hope you got value from it. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at a future event. Thank you for your time.